All right, great. I think we are live now. So I just want to kick it off and thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Andrew Cahill. I'm a research analyst here at the Block, and I'll be the host for the webinar today. So today we're talking about decentralized identity. It's kind of one of the lesser known parts of the ecosystem. I'd say that I think we all have, myself included, a lot to learn, and we're lucky to be joined today by three folks from the industry who are very well versed. So we're very happy to have them on board. So we have joining us Ning Hu from Ontology, Daniel Buchner from Microsoft, and Toby Fox from Serto. So they've been in the weeds in this stuff for a couple of years. I'm pretty new to it, and I'm hoping to just cultivate a nice conversation here. Before we get started, I just do want to give a shout out to our sponsor Ontology for making the event available for everyone, and also sponsoring a short research piece that we did that we can drop in the messages at some point if folks want to read it. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I asked that everyone ask a lot of questions. As I said before, it's kind of a topic that I think education is really lacking in. So please don't hesitate to drop them in there, and we'll be happy to pick them off and go that way. So we'll just get things started with maybe if everyone can go around and just introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background and kind of where they work. And maybe Ning, we can start with you if you want to kick things off.
Hi everyone, this is Ning from Ontology, and I'm just take responsibility for working on the technical part of the Ontology system about the network as well as the DID systems. Yeah, I think that's all. Thanks.
Hey there, Daniel Buchner. I work at Microsoft. I run the open source and standards side of what we do for decentralized identity, including some of the projects that you recently saw, like Ion, that came out a couple weeks back.
Hey, I'm Toby. I'm working at Serto. We're building decentralized identity tools, focusing on usability and onboarding new players in the ecosystem. I'm an engineer just working across the stack in building these tools.
All right, great. So then why don't we just jump right in? And one of the things that I kind of was thinking through when I started researching this a little bit was just maybe if we could just start out, and I don't know who's the best person to answer this, but if we could just start out and kind of define what we mean when we say identity. I think there's like a bunch of different ways to look at it, from like a driver's license to like a login and password to, I mean, you name it. So whoever wants to go ahead and get started on that, I think that's a good place to start.
I mean, I could take a swing at this. I perhaps have a different definition than some other folks. There's a million definitions to identity, but I like to think of it as sort of everything you say, do, express, kind of everything that defines you. Some people in legacy or traditional identity circles might identify it the way you talked about, which is like these sort of core credentials or vital record type things, where it's it's your driver's license, stuff like that. It's hard to think that that's your identity. I think if you asked any person on the street, they're not going to like pull out their driver's license and say, well, my identity is hazel eyes and brown hair, right? They're probably going to talk about like who they are as a person and all this stuff that makes them up. So I think one of the clear assertions to maybe think about a little bit is your apps are filled with your identity. Google Keep, your grocery lists, like all that stuff is very identifying. It's kind of who you are. I don't need to look at your driver's license to kind of know about you. I can look at many other things. And so for that reason, I think identity is the sum total of much of what we do digitally.
I'd also say that people have multiple identities. You can say an identity is like a name and a bunch of stuff about the entity with that name. And so, if you're an anonymous journalist, writing about some authoritarian regime and you have to hide your identity, your real identity, then you have this pseudonymous identity, and it's a pseudonymous name, and it's the social media handles of that pseudonymous identity and the articles they've written, and that's one of their identities. And then they maybe have another identity which is associated with more sort of above ground stuff, and ideally users have control over like which identity they're presenting to a service at any given time, and there's sort of overlapping subsets of that identity that they should have control over.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to maybe potentially add to that, and this distinguishing thing I love what Tobias said. I would refer to that as sort of like a slightly different word, like in terms of like a persona. So like I kind of see like your identity is like the sum total of you. It's like everything that maybe even people don't know. And then you can present different personas or reflections that might be subsets of that. Like Tobias was talking about someone in a dissident area where they're sort of, you know, maybe persecuted. They're not going to show their whole identity. They might show some pseudonymous subset of it, like some persona in that, just like people have gamer personas when they go on like Xbox or something. So yeah, I think Tobias is 100% right.
Okay, to my understanding about, yep, that's okay.
Go ahead, Ning. Sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. To my understanding, the identity, we can just turn into two different parts. One is in our real world, but the other thing is about the cyber. So in the internet, especially in different systems, the identity just stands for what we are. And actually, when we turn to different types of like smart devices, they also have their own identities. So it helps in different systems to understand what kind of things or people who they are on the internet. But otherwise, there is a bunch of things to support in our real world about helping with other IT systems for introduce who the real person or maybe the real thing they are. So when we just combine them together, we just use kind of identity systems. The identity could be used just on demand. We can either use anonymous things, or maybe we can just use some interesting stuff other than just like driver license or something like that. Yeah.
Gotcha. So then maybe that segues into a next question of kind of what's the idea behind creating these new decentralized identity solutions? Like, what's the problem that exists and that folks are trying to solve with this technology? I know that's probably a softball for everyone, but feel free to, maybe if you want to start, Toby, we can go around and.
Sure. And it's a ton of problems. So like one example is that, our data is everywhere. We're kind of spraying it in all directions and don't have any control or ownership of it. So a classic example is if you are showing your driver's license to a bouncer at a bar to prove that you're over 21, they are seeing your license and they see your name and your birthday and your address and all kinds of information, but they just need to know if you're over 21 or not. And ideally they would see, green check mark, yes, red X, no. But yeah, people don't have any way to have granular control over that data. And the same thing happens, every time you plug in your identity to a service on the internet, you're sort of giving them a copy of your data. And then everyone's data shows up in different databases around the internet, which are subject to data breaches and things like that. So yeah, it's people need to have sort of more granular control over their data, what they're giving out, when they're giving it out, who they're giving it to. So
yeah, I think that's definitely part of like sort of the core identity stuff that we talk about, like verification of someone's human attributes is typically what traditional identity professionals will reach to, right? And certainly what we're doing at Microsoft as the first wave of stuff, like credentials, very specific to proving certain things. I think it's interesting when you expand the scope of identity, as some of the other groups in the ecosystem are, like ceramic and textile and others, into the data realm. If you really think of identity in that sense, when Jack talks about blue sky and decentralizing Twitter, aren't your tweets part of your identity, right? Like, aren't they expressing things about you? And if you think that data is part of your identity and it's about decentralizing identity, I think there's a conversation to be had about what applications would look like if they potentially stored their data with you, right? So in the future, we've worked in the Blue Sky group a little bit. We think people might have these personal data stores, which certainly would contain your credentials, like your digital driver's license and all of those other things we talk about. But they also might contain things like your tweets. And so in the future, you might have an application that looks a lot like Twitter, but it's really going to your data store to get your tweets and pull from you versus going to some centralized data store. And I think it's kind of reshaping how apps data and all these exchanges happen around the user. If I had to say, like, what was decentralized identity in total?
To my understand, when we are talking about decentralized identity, actually we are just thinking about technically some kind of accounting system and like authentication and authorization stuff across multiple systems. And on the other hand, about the verifiable credential stuff, actually we are trying to create new scenarios for disintermediation for different scenarios cross systems. So in this case, the third party, we can just trust the cryptographic algorithms rather than always have the partners, the trust anchors, take part in the real scenarios for real cases. And everything can just happen in person-to-person directly, or maybe in peer-to-peer directly. Actually, this is in common sense how we communicate with each other personally. And I think this is some kind of solution we can figure out and scenarios for disintermediation based on scenarios cross systems.
Gotcha. So then maybe the next question is kind of how does the blockchain fit into this? I know it's a word that's thrown around a lot. So maybe if you guys could kind of explain just exactly how the technology is being used and kind of what happens when you move from like a centralized data storage model to kind of a decentralized model, kind of what's possible, and how the ins and outs of the actual tech work.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I think that the blockchain plays some really critical roles, but I would say it's, in terms of the bulk of the action, it's really not there. The two key places that blockchain matters in terms of decentralized IDs and decentralized identity is the PKI substrate. So today, every key that you look up really anywhere, which happens automatically when you like load a website, is coming from some sort of centralized PKI system, like ICANN, someone's maintaining a certificate authority system, things like that. So your identities really aren't your own. Things like email addresses and centralized app names are not yours. They're leased reflections of some sort of database row in someone's faraway server. So the only real thing that blockchain does is act as an anchor for the state of your IDs. And that state is really constrained to some very small primitives like your keys, cryptographic keys that you own that can prove that you own an ID that they correspond to, and then service endpoints, which are places external to the blockchain that you could go and maybe exchange data. Maybe you could send messages or exchange credentials. So really beyond IDs and service endpoints and keys, it's really there's not a lot that happens on the blockchain layer. It's mostly what you do with your IDs well above that in regular networks. I think the other nascent use of blockchain that might apply in some respects is like if you want to do the more traditional sort of open timestamps thing, and you have a credential that's minted between two parties, and then you want to anchor some hash of that in a Merkle tree or something on a blockchain. That gives you a little bit of like time-based provenance, relative time-based provenance. But those two things, I think, are the kind of the sum total of what it really is. But Tobias might have, or you might have some others.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to be clear, you don't have to use blockchains at all to use these tools. All the standards around DIDs and verified credentials don't mention blockchains, and they're more like cryptographic standards and sort of data model standards. So, for example, there is a DID method that's like DID web. So, if you own example.com, your DID could be a DID:web:example.com. And then when you try to resolve that DID to get information about that identity, you look at a specific path on the example.com domain, which has public keys and, service endpoints and other stuff there. So you can sort of manage your identity, completely off the blockchain. But yeah, there's a ton of different DID methods, and they use blockchains in various different ways. And it's sort of a lot of ways to manage that data.
Sure. So just to follow up to that, Toby, sorry, I'll call you Ning Hu. As a follow up, so like at Serto, you guys are kind of more working on the solution side as opposed to like verification side. So maybe you could talk through like how you guys think about the different methods that are out there, and if is it really just a question? Is blockchain just a utility that they're kind of all substitutes in that sense, or are you guys like looking to to move to certain chains, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, we'd like to support all DID methods, and for instance, there's the universal resolver. It takes any DID and it returns the DID doc. And once you have that DID doc, you can see the public keys and other information. And then at that point, the chain that information came from doesn't really matter as long as the cryptography works. So at Serto, we're sort of focused on the DidEth, which uses the Ethereum blockchain, because Ethereum has a huge built-in user base, people using MetaMask and other wallets. So there's opportunity for integrating decentralized identity tools there. But cross-chain communication interoperability is pretty critical to making all this stuff work. So one of the things we built is called Serto Search, which is like a cross-chain search engine that functions kind of like a phone book, indexing DIDs from different methods, supporting connecting DIDs to a domain name so you can link them to real-world entities. So yeah, the method's really not a blocker. Bring your own chain. And I think everything has to kind of work that way. In the same way that an application doesn't care who your email provider is, as long as it conforms to the email standard and you can send an email to whatever.com, then it works.
I suppose the unfortunate and controversial take I'll have is that I think there's a bunch of methods. I think it's up to like 94 or something at this, as of today, but I'm sure there'll be more tomorrow. The hard part with DID methods is the vast majority of them that are truly decentralized do require some degree of ops, and you have to be able to run a node, right? So if you use something like did web or did key, like Tobias was saying, obviously it's very easy, but it's also very centralized. So if you wanted IDs that were more decentralized, some of the methods, most of the methods that do that require you to run a node, and a node isn't like trivial. Things like Ion, like we've worked on, we tried to make that as easy as possible. Like we picked Bitcoin because it's very small. It's you can run it on a Raspberry Pi. So we got it down to like a Raspberry Pi. But when we as Microsoft look at adding a bunch of DIDs, the first question isn't really about strategic, thinking or anything like that. It's almost like just a straight ops question. You got to have someone run the nodes of all these various implementations, and it becomes difficult, right? Like you need a developer, someone there from ops to be able to sit there and did something go down? Is there an update to this software? Like it's going to be difficult. So I would posit that the industry will probably sift out down to like a handful of these really good, truly decentralized identifier methods. And that will be sort of what dominate, right? Like they'll cover the 95% of use cases, and that'll just naturally happen over time, as we saw with the early internet and all the protocols that came before it. And that's not a bad thing. It's just kind of like a market reality. People choose what works, and it kind of gets down to a select few. We hope that what we've done with Ion could be a contender for one of those potential highly used methods, but it remains to be seen, and we're kind of looking at adopting more as they sort of are used by the community and show us that they've got traction, that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Ning, maybe if you could talk a little about, I know Ontology, you guys have kind of been optimizing your blockchain for these ID and data solutions a little bit, so for a long time actually. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about this. Yeah.
Okay, for our solution, we are actually, the DID system we are trying to provide is trying to resolve the problem about data interoperability across systems. So just like accounting system and authentication authorization systems, every business cross system, there is a stage that we need to get prepared for the business. This turns to be the verification stuff, and the accounting system, if we are trying to reuse any systems inside the scenario, there's some issue about the trust. So when we are maybe there, for example, there are two different systems, they just want to cooperate with each other, but where is the main account system locked? So we cannot locate in just the system A, but in some case, there could be some trust problem with system B. So the same thing may occur. So in this case, we just think we need to find a place to provide the solution of the so-called trust endorsement for their ID systems across multiple systems. We, in this case, we just think blockchain is a good choice, and we just provide a series of business solutions trying to use DID, our ontology DID solution, so-called Ontology. And based on that, we provide a series of tokenization, which is not the public chain token stuff, but just the right control, the permission control to cross multiple systems to help on the data interoperability cross systems. And we think blockchain might be a good place to provide such kind of solutions. And also, as Daniel just mentioned, from basically there's for the protocol of DID itself, the PKI system can also just be a wrapper. So in this case, there could be a branch of infrastructure we can provide based on the blockchain instead of centralized service providers. And I think that's it.
Gotcha. So you mentioned a little bit about the commercial side and kind of, maybe you guys just walk us through kind of what the conversations have been with customers and maybe users too. We'll get to that later. But as far as like over the past couple of years, have you seen any traction in terms of whether it be companies or governments that are becoming more amenable to kind of starting to look at this kind of stuff? I don't know if Toby, if you want to kick that off or whoever wants to pick it, but.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we talk to people who are having challenges sort of managing identity and reusing stuff with their users, but they don't have any sort of understanding of what the solution might look like. Yeah, we sort of have to handhold everyone along the process because people don't know what this technology looks like at all. So that's been interesting. But for instance, we, through the ETH Denver conference, we connected with the Colorado Department of Higher Education to explore like how students might carry transcripts and educational achievements like in a mobile wallet, kind of working with them on that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of appetite to better conform to users like privacy expectations around data, but without really knowing how to do that. So they're looking to people like us to try to figure these things out.
Yeah, I think in terms of customer scenarios, because of all the COVID stuff, we got a bunch of folks who wanted to do, remote onboarding of certain, criteria, background check type stuff that gets validated and they can use across, applications to different jobs, things like that, proofs so they don't have to go in person. Beyond that, there's, we're working with some education customers around diplomas and transcripts and, all the things that typically would be yours that someone could codify and that you could reuse in other scenarios. So I think the core when in terms of core identity, like not the app side of things, it kind of all starts with seeing DIDs and VCs as a means for proofs that used to be domain locked, where you could only use it like in a certain website, or you could only use a proof across a couple websites that did a close federation, like they actually integrated each other's stacks and sort of understood each other's OAuth scopes and all that, which is pretty hard, right? It doesn't scale. You can't just do integrations with everyone on the planet. So what DIDs and VCs allow you to do is sort of codify that data into a credential that can be consumed widely. So if someone knows your DID and they trust that you're Harvard, you don't have to like go do some integration with a bunch of other downstream employers to have that proof be digestible by everyone in the ecosystem. So I think thinking of them as signed containers that are verifiable and usable kind of internet-wide is the main bit for this first wave of identity, which is these proofs.
Gotcha. Ning, I don't know if you have anything to add, and then I think there's a couple of good questions. So, do you have anything to add, Ning, to what Daniel just said, or?
Yeah, I totally agree with Daniel, and also something we can move up a little bit actually. For the DID protocol, actually the ID stands for the identifier. So in this case, we can turn a little bit back further a step. Maybe we can turn to smart devices like IoT systems. They also can have their own ID systems, which kind of DID. So in this case, we can help on different data solutions based on multiple stands on the different perspective of like smart devices. So we can separate the data from apart from the common human being use. So in this case, we can provide a series of new scenarios from stemming from the host of the multiple data sources. Could be, for example, when we are driving a car, maybe some of the data turns to be the drivers, but on other cases, this turns to be some kind of data may turn to be the car itself. So the driver can change their car while the car can change driver either. So this can provide a series of multiple actually new solutions in maybe different scenarios and provide more precisely services in maybe insurance or something. It depends.
Gotcha. And then why don't we there's a great question in the queue. Someone asked a couple minutes ago about, and I think this will help kind of folks understand, maybe we're using a little bit of too much jargon too quickly, but someone asked, how is decentralized identity possible when governments need KYC? So maybe someone could kind of walk through because I think it's a pretty nuanced, like when I think usually decentralized, whenever that word is thrown around, we always think like, ooh, like governments may not like this. But I think in this case, there's definitely a bunch of benefits that corporations could kind of realize by switching to a model like this. Maybe someone wants to attack that and kind of talk about that.
Yeah, I can go for it. So yeah, as Daniel said, basically proofs can be generated by whoever you trust. So as analogy in a different domain, your browser has a list of certificate authorities that it trusts to sign SSL certificates, which form the padlock you see in the browser address bar on an HTTPS website. So your computer has a bunch of certificate authorities saying, I trust these people. So an agent in the decentralized identity space would have a list of institutions or DIDs that it trusts for various different things, and then would accept credentials that are signed by those DIDs. So in the case of KYC, which is like know your customer, inevitably there's some kind of KYC entities that people trust. Maybe it's a government, agency, but there could be sort of third-party agencies that somehow garner trust in the ecosystem. And if you are an agent and you need to verify something, then you have to kind of curate your list of who you trust, and presumably these will maybe be shared. People can see a list on their device of sort of identities that are trusted. But this ideally gets spread out. So there's many different verifiers, many different authorities of KYC. And yeah, I don't know if the community has crystallized on like how to sort of manage this, because suddenly it's like trust becomes much more spread out. So how do you maintain these lists? I'm not totally sure. So maybe someone else has some ideas.
So to 100% right, to expand upon that, you hear this really, it's one of the things that a lot of the legacy identity people immediately, well, trust is centralized. It's like, not really. I mean, they'll say, well, the government. I'm like, well, which government? Is there just one? And then like, no, there's hundreds. I was like, sounds decentralized, right? Like decentralization is about like how many doors and sort of avenues to find an answer you have. Now, there are certain circumstances. If you're in a country and you need a passport or something to do something, there's like one authority for that. But it's an authority because everyone's either been made to accept it, unfortunately sometimes, or just generally accepts them as the authority. But in a lot of areas of life, like 90% of the trust in the world it doesn't come from government proofs, right? Most trust in business relationships comes between businesses, like bills of lading or things you're exchanging, other things in supply chain, or sales receipts or stuff like that. Government isn't involved in any of that. Those are trusted, signed assertions between entities who learn of business relationships or other linkages and then say, I trust that. Another good example of like a trust doesn't come from the government is like Dun & Bradstreet. They'll proof someone and they'll sign an assertion. Yeah, we believe this is a real business. We checked out certain other proofs and they sort of mint you this certificate. So trust doesn't have to come from governments. And I think the cool thing about decentralized identity is it's giving people a standardized platform for for pulling trust out of relationships where it's kind of been locked in non-digital sort of transfers and codifying it, so we can actually make more trust assertions now. We can populate more, vectors of trust. And when Tobias talks about where do you find, who you trust and where do you find this, one thing that, concept we're working on actively is the idea of this personal, data store, identity hub. Institutions could have them. So like Microsoft could have one of these identity hubs attached to its DID. So if you wanted to like look up some data, you'd look up a DID and you'd find this data store. And one of the types of data in the data store could be, Microsoft says, hey, we have all these suppliers, right? And we have all these partners and business entities that we do business with. And 1,000 of them have gotten DIDs. And we know, because we do business with them, those are DIDs of trusted institutions. So we publish that list of DIDs from our data store, right, as a trusted list of folks that you might consider doing business with, or that have some degree, right, of relationship with us. And you can use that as an input. You could go to a couple other DIDs, and grab their lists and say, hey, like, I've triangulated this. This particular ID seems to be a trusted business between a lot of these larger institutions. So instead of having one system like a CA today, where it's just the one list in the sky that's, sort of fixed and given to you on stone tablets, what we're giving people is the ability to say, you can create your trust circles, sort of like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? You can sort of determine who you care and trust about in the world, and then crawl that down levels and sort of spider out, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I totally agree with that, and which is much. I think that's a wonderful word if we just working on a branch of trust. Actually, when we are talking about trust, it is mainly about trust endorsement. So when we are trying to do any kind of communications or business or any kind of interactions with, or maybe the anonymous person or in the real world, we just want trust endorsement. So when we are talking about trust, actually, it is about the communication partners, nothing else. So just like KYC, or it is targeting to trying to fix the problem about AML for traditional finance system, but there's a branch of other things. Maybe I can trust someone else because my friend become the trust endorsement. So this is a typical world, can lead us a branch of much more business we can handle. So I totally agree with Daniel. And maybe like for the protocol itself, it's when we are talking about verifiable credentials, as I mentioned before, this creates a new solution about disintermediation. So whenever some anonymous person, they just hand over their verifiable credentials, it is up to us to whether to trust the verifiable credential itself. Maybe because it just provide trust endorsement from someone else. So maybe my friend can, it is not required to take part in the conversation with the partners from this business. So this is quite new, I think, scenarios to help with totally cryptographic algorithm to support. I think this can help us maybe optimize a branch of verification stuff for real business when the trust endorsement is required. Yeah.
So I guess that kind of leads into the next question of like, is there any, like, how do you see this evolving? Is there any space in particular where this decentralized trust paradigm, if you will, is most ripe to be kind of rolled out? Like, is there an area in the market where it'd be something more like crypto native, or something more in the traditional space where it's like this is an area that's pretty ripe to have a new trust paradigm kind of thrust in here?
Well, I think that there's, in terms of credentials, we just really haven't had usable cross-domain, cross-industry credential capabilities and consumption in a way that's this fluid before. So it's sort of greenfield. I think you can absolutely convert many of these things because they were locked into systems where the stuff just wasn't possible. It wasn't feasible to go to all, to go integrate with all the schools in the United States, all the universities, and say, I'm going to come up with some wonky one-off, diploma system where I like call into some server that somehow you publish, I guess, and I gain awareness of. All this stuff is kind of in these consortium communities for the last 40 years of digital technology. And it's sort of like, if you're not in the industry and you're not like plugged specifically into how that one-off protocol works, you can't transfer data. And so I think we're ripe for being able to convert a lot of current things that look like specific integrations between partners into generic flows. And that's kind of, I think, what Tobias, what we're doing. It looks like what Tobias's thing, I checked out their website today, we're trying to do is just like, let's just move these things into a more portable format that's instantly verifiable across, the whole of the ecosystem.
Yeah, we're definitely trying to kind of solve for enterprise use cases where they don't know that they need decentralized identity stuff, but we can build a solution for them that does. And then once sort of foot in the door, and then suddenly you sort of open the door to all this other stuff. To answer the question about one particular area where this is pretty interesting, it's not a digital native area at all, but the sort of employment and job application process has a ton of inefficiencies, like verifying credentials. Diplomas and employment history is actually a major pain point for employers and banks and stuff like that. And just the network effects are tough because you need to get a bunch of people on board here. But a sort of longer term goal here is that a resume, your resume when you're applying to a company, is basically a giant verifiable presentation that packages together credentials from disparate sources, including maybe ones that are self-attested by yourself. You can have references, you can have all kinds of certifications history here. Conforming to the standards around credential types for these things. And that once you're doing that, you can do all kinds of stuff. In theory, you could have smart contract logic making decisions around hiring or accreditation or acceptance into an organization based on these sort of VCified resume, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and to my understand, if there's still a branch of traditional business, they're just trusting centralized trust endorsement, I think that's okay. So fortunately, about the technique protocol itself, the DID protocol can be a wrapper for a branch of all of the public and private key systems. So DID actually is a wrapper, and if they just want, they can turn to use DID actually. But anyway, there turns to be a branch of regulation problems could be. But anyway, this turns to be a new business can bring to any wrapper using DID, because whenever we are trying to do a traditional business and bring them into the real decentralized world, it is specifically could be blockchain technology. It is not about the decentralized ID, because the idea of decentralized, I think it's disintermediation and also kind of the distributed business problem solutions, while the decentralized network about blockchain, if they are turned to be the cryptographic solutions, they can use DID and the VC stuff, can code directly by the smart contract algorithms, as well as a branch of other things, if they just trust in the disintermediation scenarios. So if the traditional business just want take a little bit step moving forward to the decentralized network world, I think DID could be a solution for that.
Another way to think about this too, just to kind of expand people's minds about what credentials could be. Credentials can be self-signed too. So
that's right.
While credentials, it would seem like a driver's license is naturally what you jump to, like someone else attesting to something and signing it against you. You as a DID holder can take a bit of data, sign it, and give a credential and say, this is verifiably from me. So a couple of use cases to highlight there. Preferences is a really big thing across all these industries, right? Like let's take travel and accommodations. You have these preferences that are sort of locked in all the travel finder websites, all the hotel chains, all the, airline stuff, right? But they ask you really the same, like 20 preferences constantly everywhere on the web. And that's not fun. Like I've never said like, oh, I really love it. I mean, I have a Marriott card and stuff, but I'm never like, when I have to go stay at a different hotel, I'm never like, oh, I'm overjoyed that I have to type all this into their system. Like it's just not an awesome process. So the idea that those attributes are also my identity, and I might be able to keep those in a wallet where if I want to go on a website and sign up with some, new airline, I don't have to replay all of that every single time. I can just say, look, I'm going to grant you access to this subset of my identity that happens to be self-asserted preferences. Some of the other things that are sort of self-asserted that are really important are things about like verifiability of media. So like right now on the internet, if you're browsing and looking at pictures and text and stuff, there's really no verifiability. Some news site publishes an image and you don't really know. I mean, they could do whatever they want to that image, right? But in the future, I mean, what if we had a future where the photographer for the AP who took the photo, in a war-torn region, immediately signed it with his or her DID in the EXIF data that's actually in the image, right, and embeds it in that metadata. And then when they propagate it on the internet, people can see what DID was from. They can look up the credentials and say, yeah, that was an AP reporter who shot that. The image hasn't been altered. It's been signed over. Now, any website that shows that image, your browser can look at it and verify the credential that wraps the image. And there you go. You have a more trusted display of information that isn't so much about credentials of trust coming from a government or some institution. It's about people just validating what they're doing in the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And then kind of, I guess in that same vein, like, how do you think about network effects? So it's not as cut and dry as like someone issuing a credential that you're going to use somewhere, but at the end of the day, you have to have buy-in from people who are going to hold these ideas and people who are going to accept them, right? So maybe it's a very wide-ranging question, but how do you start building out that network effect? Are there any like bootstrapping things you guys are thinking about that people are doing to kind of simulate this, or what's the take on that?
I suppose we have a slight unfair advantage in the sense coming from, Azure AD. I don't know if people are familiar, but Microsoft's identity system backs, in terms of enterprise identity and work and business place identity, backs the vast majority of companies on the planet, well over 90%. So if you name a Fortune 10,000, if you put them on a dartboard, you're going to hit it, right? Someone's using AAD. Now that gives us an ability, which I think Microsoft's done this the right way so far, using open public systems, going open source, using standards as much as we possibly can, to make this something where if we were to embed it in AAD, those customers, 10,000, the vast majority of the Fortune 10,000 can use this sort of out of the box with the tools and systems they already have. And I think that's good for the ecosystem. That's actually why I went to Microsoft to do this, because I wanted to answer that question that you just asked, which is, technology is great. It's amazing that we have these things, but how do we actually deploy it at scale so that we can start the flywheel? And so I think Microsoft might be a critical player in helping to do that, given the footprint.
Gotcha. Maybe Ning, Toby, if you guys have anything. I know it's a little bit different, Toby, on your end, but if you guys have any thoughts on it.
I would just add that there's an enormous amount of coordination and collaboration going on in this space. And like all the major players are involved. There's the Decentralized Identity Foundation, which must have, many dozens of organizations that are working on this stuff. So the standards are being developed with sort of everyone's input. And so as far as network effects are concerned for getting the technology adopted, we have these channels to sort of try to come to agreement on these things. So I could envision, browser native tools being developed to, pull out EXIF data like Daniel was talking about. We have these channels to do this collaboration. So I'm pretty optimistic about being able to get some of these tools bootstrapped based on the players that are building all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, from our side, actually, we create a bunch of projects, cooperate with like OpenKG, the Chinese knowledge graph, which is a foundation. Actually, they just provide a series of knowledge graph resources. We're trying to build up the IDE for each triple store, and in this case, whenever the crowdsourcing is help on this kind of contributions, so they can be incentivized by a series of either by owner, and we are trying to set up a series of solutions to help on their knowledge themselves to have their the knowledge point, something kind of that. But we can actually we just use the IDE solutions upon the data. And we also have cooperate with Daimler about so-called welcome home. In this scenario, we just provide a series of DID solutions for car themselves, which is for IoT devices, and also for drivers. So in this case, whenever any person is trying to drive some things, some part of the data turns to be owned by the car itself, while the others turns to be the end user, the drivers. So when we are trying, they can combine them together for real cases. This can turn to be a branch of peer-to-peer business. It's just like something like insurance or something like for the gas station stuff, a branch of other services. Maybe based on the car, or maybe based on the driver, or combine them together. So
I love that. I love that you brought that up, Ning, about the car scenario, because I think it's really interesting in the sense that think about like all the apps that you have. Like I have a Subaru, and then we have a different type of car, right? For the sedan that we have, and some families get the exact same brand, right? Stuff like that, and then a lot of other people have just different cars. Now the problem that occurs is you drive, I might drive my wife's car, she drives my car. So to do the things that are digitally enabled, you have to go get two separate apps to talk to two completely different protocols for two cars, when really the data that they're spitting out, even at the CPU level, is usually like OBD2, which is like the backing data outputs from cars, like in their ECUs. It's the same, right? A lot of it's the same data, it's even formatted the same, but they pipe it through these different applications, which means now you have to have two things. What if in the future, like Ning was saying, you have a personal data store, like maybe your family has a DID or you have one and your DID is the one you use for your cars, and you kind of register it with an NFC tap with both cars. And now the cars sort of, while they're under your control and you own them, they know where to go, push data and messages. And it's your DID's personal data store. So you can get that flow of information in a standardized conduit that makes its way to one wallet application, so that you're in control of all these devices. Same thing with like Internet of Things. Like it's just a big disparate ecosystem because everyone's thinking in terms of the data's with my specific device, machine, or company. When you move that data around the user, everything starts coming into sort of harmony, if that makes sense.
Thanks.
Gotcha. Yeah, I guess just another question, kind of the same vein as that KYC question. I think when people think of data, personal data in particular, they think about regulation. So maybe you can talk a little about any regulatory developments in the space, and also maybe a little bit about where a lot of this DID data is stored. We throw in the word like DID document around, and there's the word blockchain. So maybe you guys just talk about regulation, where the data is actually stored, what the concerns are, and kind of any developments there.
I'll answer about where the data is stored. It varies based on the method. So with the DID Ether method, it's stored in the Ethereum blockchain. With DID Web method, it's stored in a file on a particular servers, wherever. So yeah, there's a lot of different places that data can get stored. It's also the question of where the verifiable credentials get stored. So a user is going to have a wallet with the verifiable credentials on their app, but does stuff get stored when they need to present those credentials to somewhere? It's a lot of implementation details. As for regulation, Yeah, I mean, it's still early days here. So GDPR came into effect in like 2018. So it's pretty recent, crystallized everyone's attention on data privacy. And there's been, a lot of activity since then. But I think the goals of the regulation that's emerging and the goals of decentralized identity are super well aligned. Everyone wants to reduce centralized points of failure for data breaches. Everyone wants to give users granular control over their data. So it's probably going to be easier for organizations to follow upcoming regulations by using decentralized identity tools. Unlike Web 2.0, where people have to kind of slam on the brakes and refactor in the face of regulations, we have the opportunity to like build the ecosystem from the ground up with like forward-facing consumer protection and privacy stuff in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to where does data live, there's really this clear distinction between the DID methods and the data and credentials and things that you generate using those IDs. So in a system like ION, which is like open, public, permissionless, there's no like, authorities or, I don't know, validators or anything like that. It's just a protocol. The data, every node runs a copy that contains the data in IPFS. So they speak to each other and replicate that over a distributed and centralized file sharing mechanism. But it's only the did doc data. So did docs are like your keys and endpoints. So if you look up a did, it's sort of analogous to if I looked up a website, somewhere in the back end, it's going to a DNS server and looking up a DNS zone file, right? It's going to have like name servers, stuff like that, like core attributes it needs to get to the website. That's sort of what a DID document is. When you look up a DID, you're going to get these core pieces of keys that can authenticate, exchanges, and then service endpoints that point to other places. Now, all that other data, like the 99.99% of activity with the DID, needs to be stored somewhere else. And I think the community is kind of circling around a concept of a personal data store that we're working on in Diff and W3C, where that data will be encrypted. So like if we run it for you as Microsoft for your data store, it might be encrypted. It's going to be encrypted, so we can't read the data. It just acts as a place where people can message and trying to get access to it. So that's where your messages, that's where your tweets, everything is going to go. Not on the blockchain at all.
I totally agree. Actually, when we are talking about DID, it is about identifier. So actually, the identifier is not stand for the data instances themselves, but there's a branch of security problem need to solve if we just put data themselves to the chance. But we can just put them aside. Because we are trying to have data interoperability across multiple systems, that kind of system can just take care of the data instance, the storage, the encryption method, and a bunch of things. But for the identifier, we can just put them to the blockchain or somewhere else just to provide trust endorsement along with the verifiable credentials. In these kind of things, there's still some kind of technology that called anonymous credentials can help on the data privacy and also for the data protection aside for the verifiable credential itself. And also for the data themselves, we can provide a series of solutions to set up systems, or maybe just a reuse even for the centralized systems, which is okay. It is still up to the business itself. So I think for the DID systems, for the regulation stuff about the data, we need to separate the identifier along with the data instances themselves. While for other regulation stuff about the verifiable credentials for disintermediation scenarios, this is maybe breaking to current process, but which is durable for the smart contract code using cryptographic algorithms. So in this case, we need to wait for some time to see when the traditional business turns into the decentralized network side. Okay.
Got it. And then I guess one final question I had was so kind of looking out 5-10 years in a scenario where these DIDs become prevalent and what would that look like from a user perspective? So like I see one scenario where it's like this stuff is all happening on the back end, my data is more secure. I see another scenario where it's like I'm very cognizant of the fact that this is the way my data is being handled. Do you guys have any thoughts about kind of how that could play out over the next couple of years here?
Yeah, I think 5 to 10 years is probably the right time frame. I think in the next 5 years, you'll see a lot of building credential use cases in tight scenarios involving businesses and business consumer relationships. And then we'll start seeing it really make its way into the broader consumer conversation. I hope after 5 years, somewhere between 5 and 10, maybe you have a DID on social media that you can use across social media providers. So you're not like at this thing on Twitter and something else on Instagram or whatever. You're just you, and people can't scam as much and kind of post as you. Those are the sorts of things we want to do with LinkedIn as well, because we get a lot of that like account duplication type stuff. But beyond that, maybe 50% of the apps in your phone, they move to a model where instead of storing their application data with a centralized server, they store it with you. So something like Google Keep, where I have to type my grocery list into to Google server, I mean, that can just live in my personal data store. I can still have the same experience, it can look exactly the same as the to-do list I use today, but the data is just with me. And I guess Google doesn't get to see it, but too bad. So hopefully that's the future.
I think there's going to be some sort of splits in how this stuff gets managed. I think it's a huge UX problem for getting users to use these tools and understand them. If you look at something like MetaMask for Ethereum, it's sort of as good as it gets. But if anyone's tried to like onboard someone who's not familiar with it, that's still sort of totally bewildering to them. So yeah, the UX is a long way to go, which I think one of the biggest challenges for the next 5-10 years is that UX. But one thing that I see happening is potentially like custodied identity, which is kind of maybe a bit of a bummer, but I think it's probably going to happen. There's going to be power users who are very happy to like assemble their own collection of tools for this stuff, like for a data store like Daniel's talking about. And I can imagine sort of custodied identity players emerging that kind of smooth over the process in the way that you could run your own email server or you could use sort of an email host. I'm hoping that the community can sort of build really good UX such that we can push all the power down into individuals' hands. But yeah, potentially see a lot of ways to handle this.
Yeah, I totally agree. Actually, the same with Daniel and Toby. It is mainly a switch from the single sign-on technology to self-sovereign identity technology. So I think the key idea is whether there's a branch of user scenarios or maybe traditional web apps for end user, and we can set up a series of clients, mobile applications, or maybe even the systems for mobile systems for self-sovereign identities along with their data, just like the data store, personal data store that Daniel mentioned about. So everyone can have their own data, but they can feel free to use any kind of services globally for now for the web apps. But the data could be just a copy to the centralized servers, but they also have the traditional user experience, but the data can still keep in their own mobile systems managed by their own private key, and a branch of custodian technology can help to resolve the data migration or integration services personally for the data store. And all these can turn to be the cryptographic algorithm and technique part. This is my vision. Thanks.
Awesome. Great. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time here. So I just want to thank Ontology again for sponsoring this and making this great event happen. I think I learned a bunch. I hope everyone else learned a bunch. And if you guys want to go around real quick, and we can start with you, Ning, to kind of switch up the order and just give us a little bit about what's on the roadmap and the best way to keep in touch with you in the last kind of minute here, just to keep up with your project.
First, we set up our own blockchain, which is POS. And then based on that, we have our own DID protocols, so-called DID, Ontology product. And upon that, we have so-called DDXF, which is Decentralized Data Exchange Framework. We just turn the data token, the permission control, the access token, some kind of this, and combine the access token or maybe with a series of token protocol, and combine them together with traditional blockchain, public chain assertization token. So we combine them together, and hopefully we can have the assert token located in the blockchain themselves. Could be in multiple ecosystems. Could be Ethereum, could be Ontology itself. And also we turn the tokenization token about the access tokens to manage the access control from the Ontology side. And all these can wrapper with based on the DID system. So when we are trying to turn to be so when we are trying to have the technical part, we can have the token used for the real business. But when we are focusing on the transferring and exchange, turns to be the assertization tokens. And based on that, we set up our Saga platform. And later on, we are trying to find a branch of business solutions and scenarios for that. Yeah.
Gotcha. Great. Well, there's a lot going on with you guys. That's awesome. And maybe Toby, if you want to real quick, just best with you guys.
Yes, we're building a few products. Some are in closed beta right now, but if you're interested in being in this closed beta, please get in touch. You can find us at serto.id, at serto.id. You can contact us there. We'd love to hear from you. Follow our blog for product launches and stuff like that.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ning, Toby. I think we lost Daniel, but thanks to him again, and have a good day, everyone. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, all right. Thanks.